Okay, so I have a general medical kind of clinic. I've been doing that for quite a few decades, and we treat all kinds of things. But the last 4 to 5 years, I've been, I'm treating a lot of very severe stage 4 cancer patients. So I get all the sickies, all the ones that are, past redemption, and I've learned a lot doing that. We do a potpourri of all kinds of things. We feature ozone, obviously vitamin C. We do a lot of that. About 5 years ago, I met this guy named Russell Ryder that Ron was just talking about. And I met him in kind of a funny way. I write a newsletter, and I was surfing through PubMed, just looking at stuff, and I pop up on this article and about cancer and melatonin. And I was thinking to myself, what's the deal on that? My impression at the time was melatonin is something you take to sleep. I didn't have any idea of all the other things that it does. But what the study was about was this guy named Russell Ryder, who's a university professor for about the past 55 years of his life, has done nothing but study melatonin and its effect on animals and all kinds of experiments. If you go to PubMed and put in Russell Ryder, you're probably going to find in excess of 4,000 to 5,000 published studies. Absolutely nuts. And here was the study we did. We took some mice that were bred to get breast cancer. And I won't tell you the whole story, but ultimately the deal was he gave half the mice very high doses of melatonin. None of them got the breast cancer. And the study was repeated a few times. And I thought to myself, what am I missing here? What's the deal on that? Subsequently, I gave him a call, very accessible, got on the phone, just like Ron said. I think I'm talking to a 28-year-old guy, in terms of his energy and his speech, and he just tells me all this stuff. We're on the phone about 2.5 hours, and it just blew my mind. So that got me on the path of using melatonin in all kinds of situations, but particularly as a preventive and also with my more difficult cancer patients. So this is what we're going to focus on today is my experience with cancer patients. I will tell you, it's unbelievable the results I'm seeing with these ready-to-die patients with melatonin. Adding that into what we're already doing has really been something. So I hope you guys take this to heart and give this a chance. Okay, so let's go here. Okay, so let's kind of get into some melatonin facts that maybe you're not aware of. Maybe you are. Melatonin is produced and released in the pineal gland as a response to darkness, immediately suppressed by all light except red light. So when you're sleeping at night and you get up and go to the bathroom, if there's anything but red light on in that room, you just suppressed your melatonin production. It's not a soporific. I always thought it makes you sleepy. It doesn't. Darkness makes you sleepy. There's this whole thing, and I mentioned it just yesterday. It's so important to go to sleep when it gets dark and to wake up when it gets light. That's one of the more important things that you and I can do for ourselves. And in that great talk this morning on autism, I was just thinking just that. That's what kids need to do. They need to go to bed when it's dark. They need to wake up when it's light. But it's not a soporific. You can take it in the middle of the day. No big deal. But if you were to take it right now, big old dose of melatonin right now, and then all the lights went out, you'd probably get tired. Side effects. No serious side effects whatever. I'll tell you about one little thing we've seen, but zero side effects. And that's exactly what the writer reports in all his studies. Some patients can get some sleep disturbances, so we'll see that. I'm going to say like 5% of people, if you give them the high doses I'm going to be talking about, are going to complain they didn't sleep right, there was restless sleep, they had excessive dreaming, something weird's going on with that group. But for the most of us, it's really well tolerated. Dr. Pierpoli, who is one of the world's leading authorities on melatonin researchers, Reiter is an animal researcher. Pierpoli is a human researcher. That's the difference. So most of the stuff that you can learn that's really cool comes from Reiter, because he can do all kinds of stuff that we can't do with people. Anyhow, Pierpoli, just to give you an idea, has successfully used daily doses ranging anywhere from up to 200 milligrams a day for months. That's a 2,000-fold difference between the lowest dose and the highest. And the studies on mice show that even at astronomical doses of 300 milligrams per day, that's for a mouse, okay, not for a human. For 2 years, 0 side effects, 0 negativity. So I mention this specifically because if you go online and look at the blogs or all the other stuff out there, there's all this, melatonin could do this, melatonin could do that. It kind of gets you worried. Can I possibly use more than 5 milligrams? And just I can tell you, having used this, I'll give you a little insight into what we've been doing. But having used this for so many years in these huge doses, it's just none of that's true. Totally safe. Okay, you can test for melatonin if you want to. This particular laboratory, whom I have no association with, by the way, you can do a test for the metabolite, the main metabolite of melatonin, which you can find in the urine, which is 6-sulfathoxy melatonin. And so if you want to, do a study, you just collect some of that urine in the morning. It might be interesting to do that on kids. And collect that early in the morning and see what the low doses are and levels are, and you can diagnose it. But the point I'm making is we're giving super physiological doses, so there's not much need to even do that. After you ingest melatonin, it's going to peak out in roughly an hour, and it's going to be stable for about 3 or 4 hours. And then it's going to start to go down. So if you take it just when you go to bed at night, you'll probably have a pretty good level of melatonin throughout the night that you're sleeping. But if you're going to do it like I do with my cancer patients, QID, round the clock. I want round-the-clock coverage for melatonin. One of the experiments that Reiter did was he had this way of measuring the growth rate of the cancer in mice without having to sacrifice them. So over a 24-hour period, he could say that this tumor had grown X amount. And what he was able to determine was that when it was dark, when he turned the lights off in the cage, and the melatonin levels went up, the tumor growth stopped. And when he turned the lights back on, instantly the tumors started growing again. And so for that reason, with our severe cancer patients, we do it around the clock. Because if you stop and think about it, with cancer, it's not such a big deal if it's not growing, right? I mean, that's the whole key. Cancer's a problem because it won't stop growing. You could have cancer in your body for years, and until it reaches a certain point, you don't even know you have it. So just having it is not a problem. So if you can stop the growth, which is what melatonin does, you've done a heck of a lot. It rapidly enters the central nervous system and it crosses the blood-brain barrier, as you probably know. Exogenous melatonin does not alter the levels of any other hormones. I hear that a lot. That's no truth to that whatsoever. And this was fascinating. There's no negative feedback inhibition. In fact, if you talk to Reiter will tell you, I don't think this is actually a hormone. I think this is something else, some other metabolite that's performing a lot of other functions, because the amount of functions that this stuff does is pretty crazy. But no negative feedback inhibition whatsoever. You can take gigantic doses and not take it, and you're not going to notice a difference, except maybe in your sleep patterns. So I'm going to run through some studies here, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing. This study is entitled Melatonin, the Treatment of Cancer, a Systemic Review of Randomized Controlled Trials and Meta-Analysis. This is a really good paper. Lots of good stuff in this paper that you can learn about and all kinds of great references. First of all, they talk in the paper about melatonin activates anti-neoplastic immune reactivity. So part of the activity of melatonin is it activates aspects of the immune system that counter the growth rate of cancer. So that's one way it works, through the immune system. The other thing is it has a direct anti-cancer action. There are melatonin receptor sites on cancer cells as on healthy cells. And through these receptor sites, it actually has a growth inhibiting effect directly on cancer. So you got the immune coming in, you got the direct effect coming in. The other thing that's fantastic about it is in my practice, I use low-dose insulin-potentiated chemo almost exclusively with all my patients as part of the whole package. And they never have a side effect. I used to get side effects, even at those low doses. I used to get leukopenia, I used to get anemias, I used to get nausea, I used to get diarrhea, all the more or less common side effects of chemo. My patients come in, they get their treatment, and go out and play golf. It's pretty incredible. The other thing is we see it also with radiation. So if your patients are getting radiation, I'm going to tell you something very interesting about just the CTs, the kind of radiation you get from a CT and a PET here in a sec. But all of this is protected by melatonin. If your patient's getting radiation therapy, you give them, this melatonin will stop any peripheral damage from it. On average, the combined results of all of these studies that is discussed in this paper show that a melatonin reduced the risk of dying by 44%. And I have to say that's pretty close to what I'm seeing. It's a dramatic improvement in these patients who come to see me, and I'm thinking, yeah, you'll probably be dead in 3 to 6 months, but I'm going to see if I can't make you feel better, live a little bit longer, have a better quality of life. 6 months passes by, and I'm thinking, you're still doing all right. What's going on here? A lot of this, if not the lion's share, is this melatonin dose that we're using. The paper goes on to describe the effects were consistent no matter what dose was used. So there's quite a variation on the doses that are used. Typically speaking, you'll hear people talk about 1, 2 milligrams, 3 milligrams, sometimes 10 milligrams. You know, we're using in the order of 60 milligrams 4 times a day, 180 milligrams at night, and such like that. So there's a lot of what, but no matter what dose was used in these studies, it all has an effect. The higher doses just work better. None of the patients had any significant side effects from melatonin. So this is a meta-study of lots of other studies reporting any significant side effects. None. And that's what we've seen. And then the authors finally conclude the substantial reduction in the risk of death, the low adverse events reported, and low costs related to the intervention suggests great potential for melatonin in treating cancer. This is another study, and this was entitled The Basic Mechanisms Involved in the Anti-Cancer Effects of Melatonin. And in this one, the authors say that the melatonin has oncostatic properties. It stops the growth in a wide variety of tumors. It is a mitochondrial stimulant. And you know, if you believe like I do that all disease and especially cancer is caused by mitochondrial dysfunction, that's particularly interesting. So we've got the immune activity, we got the direct cytotoxic activity, and now we got an indirect correcting the basic cause of cancer, which is a mitochondrial dysfunction. Also, it's really good with, particularly with breast and prostate cancers, so the hormone-related cancers. And I believe it's probably effective that way because of regulation of the estrogen receptor expression and transactivation. It modulates the receptor site of these hormones. It modulates all of the enzymes involved in the local synthesis of the estrogens as well. It is a modulator of cell cycle. and an induction of apoptosis. Cancer cells, as you know, they don't much like apoptosis. They don't like to die. So anything you can do to enhance the apoptotic mechanism in cancer cells is going to be good, going to stop their growth. By the way, if you don't know it already, apoptosis comes about as a function of complex 1 in the electron transport chain. It's a mitochondrial function. That's what stimulates apoptosis. Since cancers don't deal with mitochondria very well, they don't do apoptosis. So because it's a mitochondrial stimulant, not surprisingly, it's going to induce apoptosis in our cancer cells. It inhibits the telomerase activity. Now, I find that's interesting because these days, you hear a lot of talk about, you want to have a telomerase. You want to have this enzyme that repairs your telomere so you can live longer. I have a lot of skepticism about that. And one of the pieces of skepticism I have that I've seen patients' mitochondrial function do so much better on rather large doses of melatonin over time. I can't really believe that it inhibits telomerase activity in healthy human cells. As you probably know, most cells don't have any telomerase activity at all. So I don't think this is a big deal with healthy cells, but certainly with cancer cells, this is yet a fourth mechanism of action. And another one is it inhibits metastases. So once again, if you get this early in the game, it could be a real game changer for patients. The inhibitors of the metastasis, I got a little bit more on that, is really huge. And just think about prevention, by the way. So I don't know how many of us in here have cancer right now that we don't know about. But wouldn't it be pretty cool if you did have cancer to stop it from metastasizing? Because that's the way most people die from cancer. It's not very common to have people die from cancer that is not metastasized. So that particular thing is pretty huge too. So now we got 5 ways that this is turning out to be an anti-cancer remedy. Okay, so here's some more. This is basic mechanisms involved in the anti-cancer effects of melatonin. It has, once again, these authors describe a direct anti-neoplastic effect. Also, they describe a decrease in cell proliferation and even low concentrations of melatonin in vitro studies. The cells don't proliferate nearly as well if there's some melatonin aboard. It, once again, it has a direct cytotoxic effect with the higher concentrations. And that's what we're looking for. That's why we're using the big doses. It's a stimulator of cell differentiation. So you have, you got your cells that, you got your tumor in there, right? And we tend to think all those cells in that tumor are the same. They're not. There's all kinds of different cells in that tumor. And some of these cells are a lot less cancerous than the other cells. And so if you can have a melatonin speak to those cells and stimulate cell differentiation so that they don't turn into more aggressive cancer cells, that'd be good, and that's exactly what it does. They also mention it induces apoptosis, and then they point out another thing the writer shown in his animal studies, it's anti-angiogenic. So now we have 6 mechanisms of action where melatonin can be effective on cancer. And then the authors point out that there's a synergistic effect has been found in several cancer types when it is administered in combination with chemotherapy. And I can't tell you, I have a number of patients, which probably you guys do too, that don't want to get the IPT from me, usually for money reasons. And so they go see the conventional oncologist and they get in the big old dose, and they do awfully well with the side effects from that dose, even in spite of how rough that can be. It makes a great combo for radiation and chemo. This is another study. This one's called Cancer Metastases, Mechanisms of Inhibition. So we're getting back to what Ron was just talking about. I'll just quote the authors on this. Due to the broad range of melatonin's actions, the mechanisms underlying its ability to interfere with metastases are numerous. These include modulation of a cell-to-cell matrix interaction, extracellular matrix remodeling. So it's the extracellular matrix that's going to really determine metastases. So it's extracellular matrix remodeling by matrix metalloproteinases, which play a huge role in the whole concept of metastasis. It reorganizes the cytoskeleton, which is, by the way, important for all chronic inflammatory diseases. There's an epithelial mesenchymal transition. It improves that, and then they mention the angiogenesis. Then they go on to describe the evidence discussed herein will serve as a solid foundation for urging basic and clinical studies on the use of melatonin to understand and control metastatic diseases. Here's another study. There's tons of these studies, by the way. I'm just sort of picking here, but there's a lot of them. This one's called Melatonin Uptake Through Glucose Transporters. This is a real eye-opener for me, because this is the 7th way now that it can interfere with the growth of cancers. A new target for melatonin inhibition of cancer. And I'll just read. Some functions of melatonin are mediated by its membrane receptors. So there are 2 described membrane receptors for melatonin, MT1 and MT2. And that's one of the ways that it works. But it also enters directly into the cell through the GLUT4 mechanism. In other words, through the glucose transporter system. For the latter, melatonin must enter into the cell in order to actually kill the cell without the receptor. And how does it get through there? It gets through there through the GLUT receptors. They go on. Herein, it is demonstrated that members of the GLUT family glucose transporters, that's where glucose gets in your cell, right, through these receptors, have a central role in melatonin uptake. That's how it gets into your cell, through the glucose receptors. So if you load up somebody with melatonin, what do you think is going to happen to those receptors? There's negative inhibition. The glucose can't get in there so well. Now, for our healthy cells, that's actually good. This is like a ketosis diet almost. That's kind of what you want. You don't want your cells burning glucose. You want your cells burning fat. That's the healthy way to be. And so for healthy cells, this is actually good. But for cancer cells who can't burn fat, this is the death sentence. They can't get glucose. And when you combine this by giving them like 240 milligrams of melatonin about an hour before I do my insulin, guess what happens? The insulin shuts down all the glucose that's in the patient. So we get them down to, I don't know if you know much about this, but we get them down to about like a 30 or 40 glucose level, down to the point where they're getting a little fuzzy in their eyes and they can't really think too straight. You get the glucose way down there. What do cancer cells do? Instantaneously upregulate their GLUT receptors. Massively upregulate their glucose receptors, trying to get as much glucose as they can. In comes melatonin. You got a very high blood level of melatonin. So we do it about an hour before we give the insulin. And by then, like I said, it's peaking out. And we get a lot more melatonin in that cancer cell. They go on glucose concentration and the presence of competitive ligands of GLUT1. So basically, it's a competitive ligand is what they're saying. To glucose, affect the concentration of melatonin into cells. And then finally, as a regulatory mechanism, melatonin reduces the uptake of glucose and modifies the expression of the GLUT1 transporters. And they're specifically looking at prostate cancer cells. That's interesting because prostate cancer is virtually a slam dunk with melatonin. I never see anybody have a problem with my stage 4s if I've got them on this. We use in combination of other things too, of course, and so I'm not surprised. I think it's virtually a slam dunk for breast cancers as well that are estrogen positive. More importantly, glucose supplementation promotes prostate cancer progression. So in this study, they're looking at mice and who have prostate cancer. You give them glucose, what happens to the cancer? It grows faster, right? This attenuates that. Give them melatonin and the glucose, you just attenuated that effect. Pretty cool. Okay. And then they go on and say, it prolongs the lifespan of the tumor-bearing mice, which is sort of the idea. Here's another study. This one is called Melatonin Reduces Endothelin-1 Expression and Secretion, and this one's in colon cancers. You can find this stuff on every single cancer type, by the way. I'm just showing you some of this stuff. And inactivation of FOX1, which I don't even know what that is, but NF-kappa beta. That's a huge one with cancers. So it will affect the NF-kappa beta, as you'll see in a little bit. But this endothelin-1 is a peptide that acts as a survival factor in many cancers, including colon cancer. And it induces cell proliferation, protecting the cancer cells from apoptosis and promoting angiogenesis. So the data presented here show that the melatonin inhibits the expression of the very first step in the synthesis of this thing that's a survival factor for the cancer cells. So by inhibiting the first step in the synthesis of endothelin-1, this is an 8th mechanism of action that melatonin can have on cancer cells. And the conclusion they drew was melatonin may be useful in treating colon carcinoma, in which the activation of ET1 plays a role in tumor growth and progression. So this one's looking at lung cancer. And the authors say that melatonin exerts pleiotropic anti-cancer effects against a wide variety of cancer types. Herein we review the correlation between the disruption of the melatonin rhythm and non-small cell lung cancer. So they're specifically here noticing how if you don't go to sleep when it's dark and sleep in a totally blacked out room and then wake up when the sun, if you don't do that, you're going to have a higher chance of getting non-small cell lung carcinoma. And pretty much every other carcinoma they've looked at, by the way. Ryder did a number of experiments where he just takes the animals and turns the light off and on. And he measures melatonin levels and tumor progression. And then he did one that he talked about where he took the animals and up on the top of his roof of his research building and was exposing them to the light of the full moon. And he said the guard came up there and says, "What are you guys doing up here at 2 in the morning?" He says, "Well, I'm exposing mice to the full moon." And the guard said, "Well, okay." Like that's normal behavior for this guy or something. So anyhow, full moon does not suppress melatonin production. But the ambient light coming through your window will. Okay, but the full moon is okay. Pretty funny. So on this study, they also go on to say, we also evaluate the incidence related to the effects of melatonin in inhibiting carcinogenesis. Special focus is placed on the oncostatic effects of melatonin, including anti-proliferation, here we go through the litany, induction of apoptosis, inhibition of invasion of metastasis, and enhancement of immunomodulation. And finally, we suggest that the drug synergy of melatonin with radio or chemotherapy for non-small cell lung cancer could prove to be useful. There's another study. This one's melatonin as a treatment for gastrointestinal cancer. It's a review. The ability of melatonin to inhibit gastrointestinal cancer is substantial. And this, I have a guy right now that came over to me from Nigeria, all the way from Nigeria, with stage 4 gastric cancer. Actually, it's a stage 3 gastric cancer. And when he came in, he had dropped something like 20 pounds. He couldn't eat. He was continuously throwing up. So we melatonin around the clock. And there's some other things we're doing, but I really have to say I think this is a big part of what's going on. Melatonin around the clock within, say, 2-3 weeks, he's put on 10 pounds, he's eating again, all the vomiting has stopped. I sent him home. He stayed at the clinic for 3 weeks. We did the IPT and the vitamin C and the ozone and the whole shebang for 3 weeks. I sent him home with just melatonin and curcumin. And I talked to him like 2 months later. I said, "You're supposed to be back here." And he said, "Yeah, it's a long way." And I said, "Yeah, but you're supposed to be back here. You can't, you know, how they do? They say, I'm feeling better. I don't need any treatment anymore, right?" I said, "No, you need to get back here." But it turns out he was doing great. He'd get put on another 10 pounds. He felt like $1 million. I just had to talk him into coming back. Just on melatonin and curcumin. That's it. Okay, then they go on in this review. We clarify the relationship between the disruption of melatonin rhythm and the gastrointestinal cancer, the mechanisms through which melatonin exerts its anti-gastrointestinal cancer actions are explained, including the, here we go, inhibition of proliferation, inhibition of invasion, inhibition of metastases, and inhibition of angiogenesis, and promotion of the apoptotic and cancer immunity. We discuss the drug synergy effects and the role of melatonin receptors involved in the growth inhibitory effects of gastrointestinal cancer. Once again, stop the growth. You don't have to kill the cancer. It's fine with me. Just have the cancer. Walk around with it. Play golf with it. Doesn't much matter. Just don't let it grow. The information compiled here serves as a comprehensive reference for the anti-gastrointestinal cancer actions of melatonin that have been discovered to date. Here's another one. Melatonin uses in oncology. And here they're talking about breast cancer prevention and reduction of the side effects of chemotherapy and radiation. So this is focusing typically on the reduction of the side effects that your patients are having if they're getting chemotherapy or radiation. And because of its SERM, which stands for selective estrogen receptor modulators, there's a number of them out there, but melatonin's one of them. Because of its SERM and SEAM, which is selective estrogen enzyme modulators, we talked a little bit about that. It influences not only the receptor site, but also the production of estradiol. And melatonin properties and its virtual absence of contraindications, okay? You can do this to anybody. Little kids, old people, people on drugs, it doesn't matter. There's no negative interaction across the board with anything. It could be an excellent adjuvant for the drugs currently used for breast cancer prevention. And they're specifically looking at the anti-estradiol drugs, which I actually don't use anymore. They're very effective, as you know, but I don't like them because of all the side effects. So I don't use them. I just use melatonin. Does the job just fine. The antioxidant actions also make melatonin a suitable treatment to reduce the oxidative stress. Melatonin is the most potent antioxidant mechanism in the central nervous system. It's it. It's at the top. Glutathione is down here. It's right on second place. So I won't get into it, but if anybody out there does not want to get dementia, does not want to get macular degeneration, if you take melatonin in high doses, as in the animal studies, you're not going there. You're not going to get it. It's a fantastic thing for prevention. The antioxidant actions also make melatonin a suitable treatment to reduce oxidative stress associated with chemotherapy, and especially, and they're looking at radiotherapy and the anthracyclines. Melatonin's anti-estrogenic properties are especially useful for breast cancer prevention. I would add prostate. In cases of obesity, as you know, they have upregulated estradiol. Steroid hormone treatments or chronic disruption by exposure to light at night. So in this article, they also discuss the importance of going to bed when it gets dark in a room that's so dark you cannot see your hand in front of your face unless the red lights are on, and waking up when it gets to be light. Get your body tuned into that. I think it's really important. Okay, here's another one. Protective and sensitive effects of melatonin combined with adriamycin. It's a great drug. Adriamycin is a good drug. We use it a lot. Extremely toxic in the doses that our colleagues, our oncology colleagues use. And the doses we use with IPT never have a problem. I never had a problem, actually, even before I started melatonin, but okay. So we use adriamycin a lot. This is just one example, but I think it's true for all the chemo drugs, or basically all of them. on estrogen-positive breast cancer. So they looked at estrogen-positive cancer rat models, and then the rats were randomly divided into 5 different groups. You had your control group, you had the one that got the adriamycin, you had the one that got the melatonin, and then you had the one that got the melatonin and the adriamycin, and you can guess which ones did better. The tumor weights were significantly lighter in the combined group than those in just the chemo group, or in those in just the melatonin group. So there's a synergy. Neat. Under optical and electron microscopy, the tumor cell apoptosis was obviously decreased in the melatonin-only group. And the tumor cell injury was more severe in the combined group than it was in just the chemo group. So it made the chemo kill the cancer cells better. Decreased, and they also noticed this other stuff called E-cadherin. And E-cadherin is an expression in cancer cells that increases proliferation, invasion, and metastases. It decreased that. So expression of the E-cadherin was higher in the, you want this stuff. It decreases the ability for the cancer to spread. So you were expressing more E-cadherin in the melatonin group and in even the melatonin and adriamycin group than you were in the other groups. Keep in mind now, these are doses of adriamycin that are typical for the oncologist to use. They're not the small doses. So despite that, it had this effect. Melatonin had the highest 1-month survival rate, 100%. There was the poorest quality in the adriamycin-only group, and the rats didn't move around so well. They didn't do so well. But the best life quality in the melatonin group. And then they conclude melatonin could enhance the sensitivity of tumors to adriamycin in vivo and improve the patient's life quality. This one is on cisplatin. It's another great drug. I especially like cisplatin because it's cheap. And these drugs can get insanely expensive. The other nice thing about cisplatin is that you can get a multi-dose vial in the last 30 days, so it's really incredibly cheap to use with your patients. But cisplatin, and it has platinum in it, and the platinum will accumulate over time as the patients are getting it, and it will cause some severe neuropathies, which is very difficult to turn around. So the less cisplatin you use, the better. The less the negative effect on polyneuropathy of the cisplatin, the better. And what the other thing I'll just pass on to you is a cute little pearl. I don't know if you guys know this. If your patients are getting cisplatin, you give them calcium EDTA, and it'll chelate it right out. So this is what we do. If they're going into their oncologist and they're getting the cisplatin on Monday, they come into my office on Tuesday, and we pull it out again. So it won't accumulate. And you can really help do a lot to help prevent neuropathy. The way I use cisplatin with the lower dose in combination with melatonin and the calcium EDTA, never have seen a case of neuropathy induced by me in some 5-6 years since I've been doing this. Okay, so they talk about cisplatin. Acute tubular necrosis is a major side effect of cisplatin. I've never seen it. My guy's kidneys look great, but apparently that's something that you can get with cisplatin. Melatonin is a direct free radical scavenger and an indirect antioxidant. We investigated the effects of melatonin on cisplatin-induced changes of the I can't say it, but that's the free radical indicator. A total peroxidation product and blood using blood urea nitrogen and serum creatinine. The morphological changes in the kidney were also examined with the light microscopy. Melatonin administration either before or after cisplatin injection caused significant decreases in MDA. The morphological damage to the kidneys induced by cisplatin was reversed by melatonin. The results show that the pharmacological and physiological concentrations of melatonin reduce cisplatin injury to the kidneys. This is huge. The information on melatonin as being radioproductive, guess where it comes from? The United States Army. Okay? So the United States Army kind of wanted to know when our soldiers get blasted with radiation, what can protect them. Turns out melatonin is at the top of the heap. So this is where the research comes from. I found this, it's a 1998 study. I just dredged up one day and I was like, wow, here's a whole nother use we can use for this stuff. So it is a direct and indirect free radical scavenger. The radical scavenging ability of melatonin works via electron donation to detoxify the hydroxyl radical. So it gets rid of the hydroxyl radical. Ionizing radiation. Now, cancer cells can't do that, by the way. So it is selective. It's not like you're protecting the cancer cell against the radiation. They cannot do this. They cannot move that electron onto the hydroxyl radical. It's got a lot to do with vitamin C, right? I think so. Ionizing radiation results in the production of this hydroxyl radical, and they say that the results from many in vitro and in vivo investigators have confirmed that melatonin protects mammalian cells from the toxic effects of ionizing radiation. Furthermore, several clinical studies report that melatonin administration, either alone or in combination with traditional radiotherapy, results in a better efficacy toxicity ratio during the treatment of human cancers. Don't let me forget to tell you about what to do if your patients are going in for CT or something, because that's been studied by the U.S. Army. Melatonin for the prevention of breast radiation dermatitis. That's one of the problems. I don't much like post-mastectomy radiation, but it's quite common. And so this is a double-blinded randomized trial. The radiation-induced dermatitis is commonly seen from the treatment of post-mastectomy cancer patients. Randomized placebo-controlled double-blind study. The patients were randomly associated to a topical cream of melatonin, daily use during radiation treatment and 2 weeks following the end of radiotherapy. Grade 1 and 2 acute radiation dermatitis was 59% versus 90% in the melatonin group. And they say, now this is just the cream. They don't even give it orally. Patients treated with melatonin-containing emulsion experienced significantly reduced radiation dermatitis compared to patients receiving placebo. So think of that. If your patients are going to sign up for this radiation thing, make sure they're taking oral and topical melatonin. Also, the ones that are getting the radiation for, say, cervical or ovarian issues or bladder cancer or anal cancer, all that stuff, there's so much collateral damage down there. You can reverse it, by the way, with ozone, but you can stop it by using topical melatonin down there and also the big doses we're going to be talking about. So it's very handy for that kind of thing. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, how you actually, that's just a little potpourri of the studies, but I wanted you to see there's 8 different mechanisms, by the way, this stuff works. It's well documented. I'm assured by Russell Ryder that he has never, ever seen any toxicity in his 55-plus years of working with animals at extremely high doses during their entire lifetime. So feel free to play with this stuff. When I first got into this, I'm talking to Ryder, and finally I said, well, how much melatonin do you take? He says, I take 180 milligrams every night. And, my response was, what? 180 milligrams? Isn't that crazy? He says, yes, of course it's crazy. And I said, well, why do you do that? And he says, well, I do that for 2 reasons primarily. One is that it's completely non-toxic. I could take 2,000 milligrams. All I'd be doing is wasting some money. This is not going to have anything negative effect on me. And he says, the other reason I do it is because in the animal studies, in human equivalents, that's roughly the dose that stops everything. Now, by the way, what's everything? These are the things, besides, we talk about cancer today, but these are the things that high-dose melatonin stops in the animal studies. Macular degeneration, 100%. Parkinson's, dementia, Alzheimer's, osteoporosis, cardiovascular disease, And there's something else I'm missing. I can't think of it right off the top. But anyhow, it's good. It's good stuff for us all to take. So he says, that's why I take the 180 milligrams. I said, how long have you been doing that? He said, I've been doing it 15 years. And he said, and furthermore, I know every melatonin researcher in the world, and I don't know one that's taken under 100 milligrams. And so I said, fine, okay. So I had a vitamin company make me up a melatonin pill, because the largest one I could find was from Nutricology at 20 milligrams. So they made me up a 60 milligrams. So yours truly takes 3 of those every night. Have been doing that for years. And with my cancer patients, I take 60 QID, or sometimes I'll give them 120 QID, right around the clock. Been doing this for 5 years. I've had 2 patients tell me it made them sleepy during the day. Both were over 90 years old. It might have something to do with it. But it's not very common for you to see that. Again, it's not a soporific. Okay, so dosing. I make it clear to my patients, to bed when it's dark, up when it's light. I don't care if you're sleepy, up when it's light. That'll start setting the cycle. That'll sync their cycle for them. Only red lights in that bedroom. I do not want you to be able to see your hand when those red lights are off. If you got ambient light, you get blackout screens. We're going to do 180 milligrams about 30 minutes before we go to bed, and then we're going to go ahead with the 60 straight through the day in the more serious cases. If it's not a terribly serious case, I just do HS dosing. But for your stage 4s that are kind of messed up, around the clock. I have patients that like that for 2 years now. They've been doing it around the clock. No, nothing bad, except for they're doing great, that's all. Okay, so one of the Army studies took some white cells, and this is an in vitro experiment, took some white cells in culture, exposed them to various levels of ionizing radiation, and noticed when the cells were getting damaged, at what level of radiation. And then noticed what dose of melatonin they had to put on the cell cultures to prevent that dose. And if you work out the math a little bit and look at the amount of radiation, it's a huge amount of radiation in PETs and CTs. And you use them a lot. So what can you do to offset that? 300 milligrams of melatonin. So you get some of this, the 60 milligram melatonin caps, you take 5 of them about 2 hours before your PET or your CT. And that should obviate any kind of radiation effect. Once again, I have nothing to do with these companies, but you can get the melatonin powder at purebulk.com. That actually is where Ryder gets his. I don't trust melatonin by hardly any sources because it's easily damaged. And you don't want to get tablets at all. It's damaged by the heat and the tableting process. Ryder's against the time release versions. So be careful and get good quality melatonin. I can speak for these 2 because I've had Ryder analyze both of them. One is this powder from purebulk.com, and it's a bitter, kind of nasty tasting thing. So I did have this company called, you can get them at scientifichealthsolutions.com, that makes a 60 milligram capsule from the pure stuff. There's no additives or anything in there. I think a lot of the problems, little side effects that people complain about, are due to the fact that the melatonin is faulty and or there's additives in there. Because I've had people say, oh, doc, you don't know. I can't take a milligram of melatonin or such happens. And I give them 180 milligrams and it doesn't happen. So there's got to be some funny going on. And lastly, there's 0 contraindications. And that's it. So I've got a little time left for some questions if you want to put some out there.
I just want to make a quick comment. We'll get to the questions here, but I called Russell last week and we were talking. I was just saying, how does it do this? And he said, well, your vitamin C molecule can neutralize 2 free radicals, but melatonin will neutralize a free radical and then it becomes a metabolite. Then that metabolite will reduce a free radical or 2, and then that will become another metabolite, and that'll keep going down, down, down 10 times. He says, and we don't even know that that's it. It may even go deeper than that. So you get an incredible amount of free radical sequestration with this one molecule. Okay, got all kinds of hands. Make your questions quick, please.
Hi, just wondering if you use it for secondary prevention in your breast cancer and prostate cancer.
Oh, yes. Like I said, I take 180 milligrams every night, and I encourage all my patients to take 180 milligrams every night. There's about 5% of them can't do that, and I said take as much as you can. But yeah, I believe it. I believe melatonin is the single most powerful anti-aging thing you can take, substance you can take, of anything. It's the top of the heap. If, in terms of supplements, it doesn't get any better than melatonin for pretty much the reason that Ron just sort of mentioned there.
Okay, so I believe you 100% on all of this. I've actually heard you present this before, but my brain has been trained to think that it's dangerous to take melatonin during the day. And of course, all of the studies around night shift workers, et cetera, that was one of the theories, was the melatonin levels being higher during the day. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, yes. A healthy person, I'm not really advocating it. That you take it through the day. This is for my 6 stage 4 people that are going to be dead if they don't. Yeah, I think you got a good point there.
Do you know what's the source of melatonin? And I mean for the tablets or liquid?
I can tell you that the one that I don't know where Pure Bulk gets their stuff. But the one where the Scientific Health Solutions gets their stuff comes from China. I've seen the purity report. It looks really good on the assays. I imagine there's 1 or 2 companies in the whole world that make everybody's melatonin, and people get that and then do what they're going to do with it. So I can't. It has to be synthesized, right? They're not going to get it any other way. Melatonin, by the way, occurs in plants. I just thought of that. But they do synthesize it.
They say that they have vivid dreams and they don't want to take it.
They have what?
Like very strong dreams.
Oh, yeah. So that's a complaint. So there are going to be these people that can't take it. If they tell you that, try them on the really pure stuff. And they may not really do it on the pure stuff, but they might, in which case just tell them take as much as you can. I don't know what that's all about.
Detoxification.
Okay.
Detoxification is what I think it's about.
All right, okay.
So you were mentioning that some patients were talking about having side effects. Is this with the melatonin that you were using for them, or was it conventional, maybe not pure melatonin, and what were the side effects, if any?
Like the melatonin I'm using, there's about a 5% incidence of side effects that really preclude the patient being able to do it. It's too disrupting. Does that answer your question? Was there more to it? Oh, the side effects, yes. Ironically enough, it screws up their sleep. It's restless sleep, excessive dreaming. The other one that I hear is they wake up in the morning feeling drugged, and they maybe don't get over it until 11 or 12 later on in the morning. Nothing serious, no diarrhea, nothing like that, but those are really the major things that I'm seeing.
Thank you, Dr. Schallenberger. I'd seen some data with chemotherapy and breast cancer just using 20 milligrams. Where does this 180 milligrams come from? Is that based on blood levels, a target level, or what?
The 180 milligrams comes from Russ Ryder, because that's what he does. He just told me, so that's just his word to me. That's the equivalent in human terms of the doses he's been giving the animals that have all these effects that I've been talking about.
Did you see that data on just the 20 milligrams for the breast cancer patients going through chemo?
One of the studies shows that, was a meta study that looks at all the other studies, shows that melatonin in any dose is consistent in its effects. But the higher the dose, the better the effect. And in the animal studies, roughly it's about 180 milligrams for like your average 70 kilogram adult. It's the equivalent to what the animals get. So that's where it comes from. I don't do any testing or anything like that to determine the optimal dose. Just give everybody 180.
Do you do it along with high-dose vitamin C? Do you do it on the same day as the high-dose vitamin C?
Okay, so what I do, we do a lot of stuff, but on the day of treatment, they come into the office, they are going to take 200 milligrams of melatonin 1 hour before they get the insulin. Okay. They get the insulin. About 20 minutes later, their blood sugar drops. We shoot in some chemo and then run in a lot of glucose. Remember now, all those GLUT receptors are up there. All the glucose is going to enter in. The melatonin is going to go in with it, and so is the chemo agent. Then after that, after they've recovered from that, because their blood sugar's down, we bring their blood sugars back. Right after they've recovered, we give them 12 milligrams of ozone intravenously by major autohemotherapy. Then we follow that with 50 grams of vitamin C. Then we send them down the hallway to the colonic room. But if they got a platinum, then I'm going to give them the platinum the next day. Give them the EDTA the next day. But we send them down to the colonic room, and they get 24 milligrams of ozone in the colonic room. Next day they come back, they get a nutrient IV, and they go in the ozone sauna. And that's the sort of the gist of what we're doing.
Hello. Have you done anything with melatonin IV or intravenously?
No, I haven't done just PO. That's all I've been doing. Okay. Do you know anybody who's been doing that?
I don't.
Okay.
I know there's a gentleman who's starting to use tryptophan intravenously, and he's trying to get an IRB protocol for melatonin, but he hasn't done it yet.
And as you may know, tryptophan's related to melatonin, right? And niacin and all that stuff, they're all related there. And serotonin, all that's tucked away in the same little biochemical pathway.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Schallenberger. Do you know if Dr. Reiter studied physiologic levels in animals when they're healthy, when they're sick, kind of like we increase vitamin C production in animal kingdom when we have cancer, when we have illness? Does that happen in animals naturally? Are we being blocked for our ability to be able to heal internally by our pineals or other processes? It's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. But in this morning's talk on autism, I was thinking, these kids make gigantic amounts of melatonin. It's huge compared to adults. And I'll bet you a nickel if somebody starts testing autistic kids. I don't ever see autistic kids. I don't know anything about this, but I'll bet you a nickel they find that metabolite, that 6-sulfoxy melatonin is much lower in those kids than it ought to be. I bet that's part of their problem. Don't know, but that's just my guess.
Dr. Schallenberg, in your experience with the melatonin, have you seen reduction in size of prostate enlargements and the PSA numbers?
We see PSAs going. Now, we're talking cancer, right? Prostate cancer, or maybe just benign.
Just benign BPH.
I give everybody 180 milligrams. If you walk in my office, you're getting 180 milligrams of melatonin. I don't care what your status is, how old you are, what your deal is, unless you don't want to do it. In my BPH cases do pretty well. I will tell you that the PSAs do come down.
I think we're done.
Okay.
Let's give
Thank you so
Dr.
much.
Schallenberger a hand. Thank you.